They say justice is blind, but when I looked down from my judge's bench and saw my brother Marcus in handcuffs, I wondered if justice had been watching my family all along. 30 years of favoritism, manipulation, and broken promises had led to this moment. And now, for the first time in my life, I held all the power. My name is Rebecca Chen, and this is the story of how my parents' golden boy finally faced the consequences of a lifetime of privilege in my courtroom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, I learned early that love in the Chen household came with conditions. My parents, David and Linda Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s with big dreams and even bigger expectations for their children. But somehow, those expectations seemed to apply differently to my brother Marcus and me. Marcus was born 3 years before me, and from the moment I could understand words, I knew he was special, not just to my parents, but to everyone. He was the kind of child who seemed to glow, charismatic, naturally athletic, and blessed with the kind of easy charm that made adults light up when he entered a room. I, on the other hand, was what my mother politely called studious. While Marcus was scoring winning goals in soccer and charming his teachers, I was buried in books, methodically working toward perfect grades that somehow never seemed to impress anyone as much as Marcus's effortless B-plus average. The pattern established itself early. When Marcus broke our neighbor's window playing baseball, my parents paid for the replacement and laughed about boys being boys. When I accidentally knocked over my mother's favorite vase while reading on the couch, I was grounded for a week and had to pay for a replacement for my allowance. When Marcus got his driver's license at 16, my parents bought him a used Honda Civic. When I turned 16, they told me I could drive Marcus's old bike to school until I'd saved enough money for my own car. But the real difference became apparent when it came to our futures. Marcus breezed through high school with average grades and a charming smile while I graduated as valedictorian. Yet when college applications came around, my parents hired a private counselor for Marcus and told me to figure it out myself because I was naturally good at that stuff. The message was clear. Marcus was the investment. I was expected to succeed. On my own, college was supposed to be my escape. But even 3 states away at Northwestern University, I couldn't outrun my family's dynamics. Marcus had chosen Arizona State University, staying close to home, and my parents treated his decision like a gift to them personally. I threw myself into my studies with the kind of desperate intensity that comes from needing to prove something. To people who aren't paying attention, I double majored in political science and criminal justice, maintained a 3.9 GPA, and spent my summers interning at law firms and district attorneys' offices. Marcus, meanwhile, was having what my mother called the full college experience. He joined a fraternity, played intramural sports, and changed his major 3 times. When his grades slipped, my parents hired tutors. When he got arrested for underage drinking, my father hired a lawyer. He needed money for spring break. Trips. They opened their wallets without question. I paid for my own education through scholarships, part-time jobs, and student loans. I spent spring breaks working at a local law firm for experience and spending money. When I called home, the conversations were always brief and focused on Marcus's latest adventures. The breaking point came during my senior year. I had been accepted to Harvard Law School, a dream I'd worked toward for years. I called my parents expecting them to be proud, maybe even excited. Instead, my mother's first words were, "That's nice, dear. Marcus just got accepted to graduate school too." Marcus's graduate school was a 1-year MBA. It's a program at a local college that accepted anyone with a pulse and a checkbook. But in that moment, I realized that no achievement would ever be big enough to shift my parents' attention away from their golden child. Harvard Law. School was where I finally found my people. Surrounded by other driven, ambitious students, I discovered what it felt like to be appreciated for my intellect and dedication. I threw myself into every opportunity: law review, moot court, judicial internships. During my second year, interned at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston, where I met Judge Patricia Williams. She was everything I aspired to be: brilliant, fair, and utterly uncompromising when it came to justice. She became my mentor, and under her guidance, I began to see a path forward that didn't require my parents' approval or support. The law, Judge Williams told me one afternoon as we reviewed case files, is the one place where your merit speaks louder than your connections. Remember that. I graduated from Harvard Law summa cum laude and clerked for a federal judge in Chicago. After that, I joined the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, where I quickly gained a reputation as a prosecutor who didn't back down from difficult cases. Meanwhile, Marcus was struggling to find his footing. His MBA led to a series of entry-level jobs that he quit or was fired from within months. Each failure was met with understanding from our parents, who blamed bad bosses, poor timing, or simple bad luck. They continued to support him financially, paying his rent and credit card bills while he figured things out. I, on the other hand, was working 80-hour weeks and living in a studio apartment, saving every penny for my future. When I called home, which became increasingly rare, the conversations were always the same. Marcus was going through a tough time. Marcus needed their support. Marcus was dealing with challenges I couldn't understand. The distance between us wasn't just geographical anymore. It was emotional, psychological, seemingly unbridgeable. 5 years into my career as a prosecutor, I made a decision that would change everything. I applied for a judicial position, 32. I was young for a judge, but my record was impeccable. I had tried hundreds of cases, won several high-profile convictions, and earned the respect of both my colleagues and the defense attorneys who opposed me. The confirmation process was grueling. Background checks, interviews, public hearings. Through it all, I waited for my parents to call, to express pride, to acknowledge that their daughter was about to become one of the youngest judges in Illinois history. The call never came. Instead, I learned through a cousin that Marcus had been arrested again, this time for embezzling money from the nonprofit organization where he'd been working as a development coordinator. The amount was substantial, $125,000 over 18 months, taken through a sophisticated scheme involving fake vendors and diverted donations. My parents were devastated, but not in the way you might expect. They weren't ashamed of Marcus's actions. They were angry at the organization for not supporting him better and convinced that the charges were somehow unfair. They hired the best criminal defense attorney money could buy and began a campaign to portray Marcus as a victim of circumstance. I was confirmed as a judge 2 weeks later. The ceremony was held at the courthouse with my colleagues and mentors in attendance. My parents didn't come. They were too busy dealing with Marcus's situation. As a newly appointed judge, I was careful to maintain my integrity and avoid any appearance of impropriety. I recused myself from cases where I had prior involvement as a prosecutor, disclosed any potential conflicts of interest, and built a reputation for fairness and thorough preparation. Marcus's case, meanwhile, was winding its way through the system. The evidence against him was overwhelming: bank records, forged documents, witness testimony from coworkers who had tried to report suspicious activity. But my parents remained convinced that somehow, some way, Marcus would find a way out of this mess like he always had. They mortgaged their house to pay for his defense attorney. They hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on the prosecution witnesses. They even started a GoFundMe campaign, portraying Marcus as a dedicated nonprofit, a worker who had been wrongfully accused. I watched all of this from a distance, feeling a mixture of sadness and anger. Sadness for the parents who couldn't see what their son had become. Anger at the system that had created this monster through decades of enabling and excuses. The preliminary hearings were held in a different courthouse under a different judge. Marcus pled not guilty to all charges, and his attorney began building a defense based on mental health issues and family trauma. I found this last part particularly insulting, as if growing up in a loving, supportive household where every mistake was forgiven and every failure was cushioned had somehow traumatized him. But then, 6 months before the trial was scheduled to begin, the assigned judge had a heart attack and had to step down. The case was reassigned randomly through the court's computer system. The universe, seemed, had a sense of irony when I opened the case file and saw People v. Marcus Chen. I stared at the documents for a long time. The ethical thing to do was obvious. I needed to recuse myself immediately. No judge should preside over a case involving their own family member. But as I read through the charges and evidence, something else stirred in me. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This was about every victim of his selfishness. Every person who had donated money to that nonprofit believing it would help children in need. Every honest person who had been passed over for opportunities because someone like Marcus had charmed his way into a position he didn't deserve. I called my judicial mentor, Judge Williams, now retired but still sharp as ever. "Patricia," I said, "I need advice on an ethical dilemma." I explained the situation without mentioning names. A judge discovered that a family member was scheduled to appear in their courtroom. The obvious conflict of interest. The equally obvious need to recuse. "The law is clear," she said. "You have to recuse yourself, but I'm sensing there's more to this story." I told her about the years of favoritism, the enabling, the way my parents had always protected Marcus from consequences. I told her about the victims in this case, and how I was probably the one judge in the system who truly understood what kind of person Marcus was. "Rebecca," she said finally, "your job as a judge is to be impartial. If you can't be impartial, you must recuse yourself. But if you can set aside your personal feelings and judge this case solely on the evidence and the law, then you have a duty to justice that transcends family loyalty." That night I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I didn't file the recusal motion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first day of trial, I watched my parents enter the courtroom with Marcus and his attorney. They had aged in the months since his arrest, the stress etched deep in their faces. Marcus, on the other hand, looked confident. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and his characteristic smile. Even facing prison time, he believed he could charm his way out of trouble. When they realized I was the judge, the shock was palpable. My mother gasped audibly. My father's face went pale. Marcus's attorney immediately requested a conference. In chambers, "Your Honor," the defense attorney, Michael Richardson, said once we were alone, "I need to move for your recusal. This is clearly a conflict of interest." "On what grounds?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "The defendant is your brother. You cannot possibly be impartial in this case." I leaned back in my chair, considering my words carefully. "Mr. Richardson, I want to be very clear about something. I have had no contact with the defendant in over 5 years. I have not discussed this case with him or any members of my family. I have no financial interest in the outcome. I am prepared to judge this case solely on the evidence presented and the applicable law. But, Your Honor," furthermore I continued, "I would argue that my knowledge of the defendant's character and history actually makes me more qualified to assess his credibility and the likelihood of his claims, not less." Richardson looked stunned. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The appearance of impropriety alone will be avoided by my scrupulous adherence to the law and evidence." Motion denied. We'll begin jury selection tomorrow. That night, my phone rang constantly. My parents, my aunt, family friends, everyone wanted to know what I was doing, why I wasn't helping Marcus, how I could be so cold and calculated. I turned off my phone and spent the evening reviewing case law on judicial ethics and familial conflicts. I was walking a tightrope, but I was determined to prove that justice could be blind. Even when it involved family, the prosecution's case was methodical and damning. They called bank officials who testified about the fake accounts Marcus had created. They brought in the nonprofit's bookkeeper who had discovered discrepancies in the donation records. They presented emails Marcus had sent to fictitious vendors, authorizing payments that went directly into his personal accounts. Each witness painted a picture of calculated deception. This wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. It was A sustained campaign of theft that had lasted 18 months. I watched Marcus throughout the testimony, noting his reactions. When damaging evidence was presented, he would lean over to whisper to his attorney, as if he could talk his way out, of documents and bank records. When witnesses described his behavior, he would shake his head slightly, as if their testimony was somehow unreasonable. My parents sat in the gallery, alternating between looking devastated and defiant. During breaks, I could see them comforting Marcus, assuring him that everything would be okay, even now facing overwhelming evidence of his guilt. They couldn't accept that their golden boy had fallen so far. The prosecution's star witness was Angela Martinez, the nonprofit's executive director. She testified about how Marcus had been hired specifically because of his charm and ability to connect with donors. She described how he had been given access to financial systems because he seemed so trustworthy, so dedicated to the cause. He would talk passionately about the children we were helping, she said, her voice breaking slightly. He seemed to genuinely care about our mission. That's what made his betrayal so devastating. Under cross-examination, Richardson tried to paint Martinez as a negligent administrator who had failed to properly supervise Marcus. But her testimony was clear and compelling. Marcus had been trusted. Because he had earned that trust through months of exemplary behavior before beginning his theft, Richardson's defense strategy was exactly what I had expected. Marcus was a victim of circumstances, struggling with undiagnosed mental health issues and family pressure. They brought in a psychiatrist who testified that Marcus suffered from anxiety and depression, conditions that had impaired his judgment. I listened to this testimony with growing anger. Mental health struggles were real and serious, but they didn't excuse theft. Thousands of people dealt with anxiety and depression without stealing from charities. The defense was trying to medicalize, was essentially a moral failing. But the most infuriating part came when Richardson called my parents as character witnesses. My mother took the stand first, describing Marcus as a sensitive, caring child who had always tried to do the right thing. She talked about his volunteer work in high school, his love of animals, and his kindness to elderly neighbors. She painted a picture of a young man who had simply lost his way, not a criminal who had systematically stolen from children in need. Marcus has always been the kind of person who puts others first, she testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. He's made mistakes, but he's not a bad person. He's just ... lost. My father's testimony was similar, but he added something that made my blood boil. Marcus has always lived in his sister's shadow. Rebecca was always the perfect one, the one who never needed help or support. I think the pressure of trying to measure up to her drove him to make some poor choices. I had to grip the edge of the bench to keep from reacting visibly. After 30 years of being ignored and dismissed, my parents were now blaming me for Marcus's crimes. According to their testimony, I wasn't just the sister who had been overlooked. I was the cause of Marcus's downfall. Against his attorney's advice, Marcus insisted on testifying in his own defense. I had to admit it was a bold move. Marcus had always been able to talk his way out of trouble, and he clearly believed he could do it again. He took the stand wearing a contrite expression that I recognized from childhood, the same look he'd worn when caught breaking curfew or lying about his grades. He spoke softly, forcing the jury to lean in to hear him. "I want to start by saying how sorry I am," he began. "No, I've disappointed a lot of people, and I take full responsibility for my actions." But as his testimony continued, it became clear that Marcus's version of taking responsibility was very different from actual accountability. He blamed the nonprofit's poor financial controls. He claimed the stress of his job had affected his judgment. He suggested that the organization's executives had been negligent in their oversight. "I never intended to hurt anyone," he said, looking directly at the jury. "I was struggling with personal issues and I made some terrible decisions. Not the monster the prosecution is trying to make me out to be. I'm just a person who makes mistakes." The prosecutor's cross-examination was devastating. She walked Marcus through each transaction, each forged document, each lie he had told to cover his tracks. She showed him emails he had sent to fictitious vendors, deposits he had made to his personal accounts, vacation photos he had posted on social media using stolen money. "Mr. Chen," she said, "you've testified that you never intended to hurt anyone. but you spent this stolen money on luxury vacations, expensive clothes, and restaurant meals, while children who needed help went without. How do you reconcile that? Composure finally cracked. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was in a bad place mentally. But you were thinking clearly enough to create fake vendor accounts, forge approval signatures, and delete incriminating emails, weren't you? I was trying to fix things. Fix things. Cover them up. Marcus looked directly at me for the first time during the trial. In his eyes, I saw a mixture of desperation and entitlement, the same look he'd given me as a child when he wanted me to cover for him with our parents. But this time, I wasn't going to save him. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. Marcus's legs gave out. He collapsed into his chair. My parents began sobbing in the gallery. His attorney put a comforting hand on his shoulder, but I could see the defeat. In Richardson's eyes, he had known this was coming. I watched all of this from my bench, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it had cost my family everything. During the sentencing phase, I had to listen to more testimony about Marcus's character and circumstances. Former teachers, college friends, and family members all testified about his good qualities and asked for leniency. The nonprofit's victims also testified, describing how Marcus's theft had forced them to cut programs and lay off staff. Angela Martinez spoke last. Your Honor, this isn't just about money, it's about trust. Marcus Chen betrayed everyone who believed in him, everyone who thought he was working to help children in need. The damage he's done goes far beyond the financial loss. Sentencing day arrived 3 weeks later. I had spent hours researching similar cases, consulting sentencing guidelines, and wrestling with my conscience. The law was clear about the range of punishment for Marcus's crimes, but as a judge, I had discretion within that range. Marcus stood before me in shackles, flanked by his attorney. My parents sat in the front row, holding hands and staring at me with a mixture of hope and reproach. They still believed, somehow, that I would save their golden boy. Mr. Chen began, you have been convicted of embezzlement, fraud, and theft from a charitable organization. These are serious crimes that strike at the heart of public trust in nonprofit institutions. I paused, looking at my brother, really looking at him for the first time in years. The charm was gone now, replaced by fear and desperation. This was what he really was underneath all the charisma and manipulation. The evidence in this case shows a pattern of calculated deception spanning 18 months. You created fake vendor accounts, forged authorization signatures, and systematically diverted funds intended for children in need. When confronted with discrepancies, you lied to your supervisors and attempted to cover up your crimes. Attorney had prepared a lengthy plea for mercy, but I had already made my decision. The defense has asked me to consider your difficult childhood and family circumstances. However, I find no evidence that you suffered any hardship or trauma that would explain or excuse your behavior. In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite, that you were raised in a loving, supportive environment where your mistakes were consistently forgiven and your failures were cushioned. Your pattern of behavior suggests not someone who made mistakes, but someone who has never learned to face consequences. The court has a duty, not just to punish crime, but to protect society from those who would prey on the trust and generosity of others. I looked directly at Marcus, who was staring at me with undisguised shock. Therefore, I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You will also pay restitution in the amount of $125,000, plus interest and court costs. The sentence was at the higher end of the guidelines, but well within the legal range. Marcus's knees buckled, and he had to be supported by his attorney. My parents were sobbing openly now, and I could hear my mother saying, how could she do this to her own brother? But I felt something I hadn't experienced in 30 years. The satisfaction of being truly fair and impartial. The story made national news within hours. Judge sentences own brother to prison was the headline that appeared on news websites and social media feeds across the country. Some praised me for my integrity and commitment to justice. Others condemned me as cold and vindictive. My parents were among the latter group. They left the courthouse without speaking to me and haven't spoken to me since. They gave interviews. 2 local news stations, portraying me as a jealous sister who had used her position to get revenge on her more successful brother. The irony wasn't lost on me. Even in prison, Marcus was still the victim in their eyes. My judicial colleagues were supportive, recognizing the difficult position I had been in. Judge Williams called me the day after sentencing. "You did the right thing," she said. "It couldn't have been easy." "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," I admitted, "but it was also the most important." The State Judicial Ethics Board launched an investigation into my decision not to recuse myself. After 6 months of review, they concluded that while my choice was controversial, it hadn't violated any ethical rules. I had disclosed the relationship to all parties, followed proper procedures, and based my decisions solely on the evidence and law. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source: the charity's donors. Letters poured in from people who had contributed to the nonprofit, thanking me for holding Marcus accountable. One letter, from an elderly woman who had donated her late husband's pension, particularly stuck with me. "Thank you for showing that justice applies to everyone, even family. My husband worked his whole life to help children, and knowing that someone stole from his legacy broke my heart. You've helped restore my faith in the system." 2 years have passed since Marcus's sentencing. He's serving his time at a federal facility in Texas, and according to my sources, he's not adapting well to prison life. The charm and manipulation that had served him so well in the outside world don't work the same way behind bars. My parents have cut off all contact with me. They've moved to a smaller house and spent their weekends visiting Marcus in prison. They've started a blog called Justice Failed, where they chronicled the supposed injustices of the legal system and their son's wrongful conviction. I try not to read it, but sometimes I can't help myself. In their version of events, Marcus is a political prisoner, victimized by a corrupt system and a jealous sister. They've raised money for his appeals and continue to maintain his innocence. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, the hardest part isn't their anger, it's their complete inability to see what they created. 30 years of enabling, excusing, and protecting Marcus from consequences had produced a man who genuinely believed he was above the law. In trying to save him from every small failure, they had guaranteed his ultimate catastrophic downfall. I've been in therapy for the past year, working through the complex emotions of losing my family while finally achieving justice. My therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, has helped me understand that my parents' favoritism wasn't about Marcus being more deserving of love. It was about their own insecurities and fears. They protected him because they saw him as fragile, she explained. During one session, they expected you to be strong and independent because you demonstrated those qualities early, but that doesn't make their treatment of you fair or healthy. The cases had consequences far beyond my family. The nonprofit has implemented new financial controls and oversight procedures. They've recovered about half of the stolen money through asset forfeiture and insurance claims. Angela Martinez has become a national advocate for nonprofit financial transparency. Marcus's conviction has also led to investigations of other nonprofits where he had worked. 2 additional cases of financial irregularities have been discovered, though the amounts were smaller and the evidence less clear. It seems my brother's criminal behavior dated back much further than anyone had realized. The legal community has used my case as a teaching tool for judicial ethics courses. Law schools now include People v. Marcus Chen in their curriculum as an example of the complexities judges face when personal and professional duties conflict. I've been invited to speak at conferences about judicial independence and the importance of impartial justice. It's strange to be known for something so personal, but I've come to see it as an opportunity to advocate for the principle that justice must be blind. Even when it's painful, while I lost my birth family, I've gained something else, a deeper understanding of what justice really means. I've also found a new kind of family in my colleagues and friends who supported me through the most difficult period of my life. My court clerk, Jennifer Walsh, became one of my closest confidants during the trial. She helped me navigate the media attention and provided emotional support when the pressure became overwhelming. "You know what impressed me most?" she said recently. "You never once wavered in your commitment to doing the right thing, even when it cost you everything." I've also grown closer to my mentor, Judge Williams, who has become like a mother to me. She understands the loneliness of the bench and the weight of making decisions that affect people's lives. "The hardest cases are the ones where you can't make everyone happy," she told me. "But that's when your integrity matters most." Marcus has filed multiple appeals, each one claiming that I should have recused myself and that his conviction was tainted by family bias. His attorneys argue that I couldn't possibly have been impartial and that my sentence was vindictive. Each appeal has been denied. The appellate courts have consistently ruled that while my decision not to recuse was controversial, it wasn't illegal. They've noted that I disclosed the relationship, followed proper procedures, and based my rulings on evidence and law rather than personal animus. The Supreme Court declined to hear his final appeal last month. Marcus's conviction is now final, and he'll serve his full sentence, minus time for good behavior. I try not to think about what will happen when he's released. Will he have learned from his experience, or will he continue to blame everyone else for his choices? Will my parents still enable him, or will they finally see the truth about what they created? My case has sparked discussions about judicial ethics, family dynamics, and the nature of justice itself. Legal scholars have written articles analyzing my decision from every angle. Some argue that I should have recused myself regardless of my ability to be impartial. Others contend that my unique knowledge of Marcus's character made me the ideal judge for the case. Dr. Amanda Foster, professor of judicial ethics at Yale Law School, wrote in the Harvard Law Review, Judge Chen's case represents a perfect storm of personal and professional obligations. While her decision was legally sound, it raises important questions about the appearance of impropriety and public confidence in the judicial system. Professor Robert Martinez of Stanford Law School took a different view. Judge Chun's ruling demonstrates that justice can transcend family loyalty. Her decision to prioritize her oath as a judge over her role as a sister shows the highest level of judicial integrity. The debate continues, but I've made peace with my decision. I know I acted according to my conscience and the law, and that's all any judge can do. 5 years have passed since I took the bench, and I've built a reputation as a fair but tough judge. I've handled hundreds of cases, from minor misdemeanors to major felonies, and I've tried to bring the same level of integrity to each one that I brought to Marcus's case. I've also found love, something I never expected after the trauma of losing my family. David Thompson is a defense attorney who appeared in my courtroom last year. He's everything Marcus wasn't: honest, hardworking, and genuinely committed to justice. We've been dating for 8 months, and he's helping me understand that not all families are built on favoritism and dysfunction. "You know what I admire about you?" he said recently. "You've never let bitterness define you. You could have become cynical and angry, but instead you've become more compassionate." It's true. Seeing Marcus's victims testify, understanding the real impact of his crimes, has made me more aware of how judicial decisions affect real people. I've started volunteering with victim advocacy groups and speaking at schools about the importance of personal responsibility. Last month, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Marcus, writing from prison. After 2 years of appeals and blame, he had finally written to me directly. "Rebecca," the letter began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to write this. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, and I need to say something I should have said years ago. I'm sorry." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing his realization that his behavior had been wrong, his understanding of the pain he had caused his victims, and his acknowledgement that I had done what I had to do as a judge. "I used to think you sentenced me because you were jealous or angry," he wrote. "But I understand now that you were the only person who was brave enough to hold me accountable. Mom and Dad protected me from consequences my whole life, and it turned me into someone I'm ashamed to be." He described his experience in prison, the programs he was attending, and his plans for when he was released. He asked for nothing. No favors, no forgiveness, no relationship. He simply wanted me to know that he finally understood what I had done and why. I read the letter 3 times before putting it away. I haven't decided whether to respond. Some wounds take time to heal, and some relationships can't be rebuilt. But for the first time in years, I felt hope that my brother might actually become the person our parents always believed he was. Today, as I sit in my chambers preparing for another day of court, I think about the journey that brought me here. I lost my family, but I found my purpose. I sacrificed my relationships, but I preserved my integrity. I made enemies, but I also made peace with myself. The scales of justice that sit on my desk remind me. Every day that fairness doesn't mean treating everyone the same. It means treating everyone according to what they deserve. Marcus deserved consequences for his choices. Just as I deserved respect for mine, my parents still haven't spoken to me. I've accepted that they may never understand what I did or why. Their love was always conditional, based on Marcus's charm and neediness, rather than merit or character. I can't change that, but I can live with the knowledge that I finally broke free from their expectations. The irony isn't lost on me that by choosing justice over family, I became the person I was always meant to be. I'm not the ignored second child anymore, competing for scraps of attention and approval. I'm Judge Rebecca Chen. I've earned every bit of respect that comes with that title. Sometimes people ask me if I regret my decision not to recuse myself from Marcus's case. The answer is simple: no. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my family fell apart. And I regret that it took 30 years for Marcus to face consequences for his behavior. But I don't regret ensuring that justice was served. The law is supposed to be blind, but sometimes it takes someone who can see clearly to make sure justice is done. In my brother's case, I was that someone. And given the chance to do it again, I would make the same choice every time. Because at the end of the day, we all have to live with the consequences of our choices. Marcus learned that lesson the hard way, and so did I. But unlike him, I can look in the mirror and be proud of the person looking back. Justice isn't always pretty, and it isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. Sometimes, it takes a lifetime to understand that the scales of justice weigh heavier than the bonds of blood. My name is Rebecca Chen. This is my story of how I chose justice over family and finally found peace with both. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.